My name is Kenji Nakamura, and for 15 years I was the financial architect behind one of Japan's most sophisticated money laundering operations, moving over 50 billion yen annually through a network of legitimate businesses that served as fronts for the Sumiyoshi Kai's massive criminal empire. I wasn't a street enforcer or a traditional gangster. I was something far more valuable and dangerous. A certified public accountant who understood how to make dirty money disappear into the legitimate economy without leaving a trace. My expertise in international banking, cryptocurrency exchanges, and complex financial instruments made me indispensable to an organization that generated enormous profits from pachinko parlors, real estate manipulation, construction, bid rigging, and countless other illegal enterprises that required sophisticated financial management to avoid detection by Japan's increasingly vigilant financial authorities. For over a decade, I lived a double life that would have impressed any spy novelist by day. I was a respected financial consultant with offices in Tokyo's prestigious Marunouchi district, advising legitimate corporations on tax optimization and international investments. By night, I was orchestrating the movement of criminal proceeds through a labyrinthine network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate businesses that I had carefully constructed to withstand even the most thorough government investigations. The money flowed like a digital river through my systems, millions of yen converted to dollars, euros, and Bitcoin, then filtered through real estate purchases in London, art acquisitions in New York, and technology investments in Silicon Valley, before returning to Japan as apparently legitimate business profits. But what the Yakuza bosses who trusted me with their fortunes didn't know was that I was secretly documenting every transaction, every account, every illegal transfer, building a comprehensive archive that would eventually become the key to bringing down their entire financial network and securing my own freedom from a world that had slowly consumed my soul. People think they understand how organized crime works until they see the sophisticated financial machinery that actually powers these operations in the modern world. The popular image of Yakuza as tattooed thugs collecting protection money in dark alleys is decades out of date. Today's criminal organizations are multinational corporations with annual revenues that rival legitimate Fortune 500 companies, employing teams of lawyers, accountants, and financial experts who understand global markets better than most investment banks. I discovered this reality in 2008, fresh out of Waseda University with a master's degree in international finance and naive dreams of building an honest career in Japan's financial sector. The economic crisis had devastated the job market, and after months of rejection from traditional banks and consulting firms, I was desperate enough to accept a position with what appeared to be a legitimate investment company called Pacific Prosperity Holdings. The office was impressive, floors above Tokyo Bay, with panoramic views of the city, staffed by impeccably dressed professionals who spoke multiple languages and managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of yen. My initial responsibilities seemed straightforward, analyzing investment opportunities in Southeast Asian markets, preparing financial reports for wealthy clients, and managing currency exchanges for international business transactions. It wasn't until my third month on the job that I began to notice the irregularities. Cash deposits that didn't match the documentation, investment returns that defied market logic, and client meetings that took place in pachinko parlors rather than conference rooms. When I finally understood what I had stumbled into, I faced a choice: that would define the next 15 years of my life. Walk away and risk never finding another job in Japan's tight-knit financial community, or stay and learn to navigate the treacherous waters of criminal finance while secretly planning my eventual escape. The decision was easier than it should have been. I was young, ambitious, and fascinated by the intellectual challenge of managing money flows that operated outside the normal rules of economics and law. My education in criminal finance began with small assignments that seemed almost mundane compared to the dramatic crimes portrayed in movies and television shows. I was tasked with creating legitimate-looking invoices for construction projects that existed only on paper, establishing shell companies in jurisdictions with strict banking secrecy laws, and developing investment strategies that could explain sudden influxes of cash from unexplained sources. The work required a combination of technical expertise and creative thinking that I found intellectually stimulating, even as I gradually understood the moral implications of what I was doing. My supervisor, a soft-spoken man named Tanaka-san, who wore expensive suits and spoke perfect English, became my mentor in the art of financial obfuscation. He taught me how to exploit loopholes in international banking regulations, how to structure complex transactions that would confuse even experienced auditors, and how to maintain the appearance of legitimacy while moving enormous sums of criminal proceeds through the global financial system. The key, he explained, was to think like water, always finding the path of least resistance, flowing around obstacles rather than confronting them directly, and never leaving traces that could be followed back to the source. Under his guidance, I learned to create financial instruments so complex that even the people using them didn't fully understand how they worked, to establish business relationships with legitimate companies that unknowingly served as conduits for money laundering, and to exploit the natural greed and willful blindness of financial institutions that were happy to accept large deposits without asking too many questions about their origins. Within 2 years, I had become one of the most valuable assets in the organization's financial division, trusted with increasingly sensitive operations and given access to information that revealed the true scope of the Sumiyoshikai's business empire. I discovered that they controlled not just traditional criminal enterprises, but also legitimate businesses in construction, real estate, entertainment, and technology, a vast network of interconnected companies that generated billions of yen in annual revenue while providing perfect cover for money laundering operations. The deeper I penetrated into the organization's financial structure, the more I understood that I wasn't just working for a criminal gang, I was part of a shadow economy that paralleled and intersected with Japan's legitimate business world in ways that would shock most citizens. The Sumiyoshikai's financial empire extended far beyond simple money laundering into sophisticated market manipulation, real estate speculation, and political influence operations that affected everything from municipal construction contracts to national economic policy. My role evolved from simple transaction processing to strategic financial planning, helping the organization's leadership make investment decisions that would maximize their profits while minimizing their exposure to law enforcement scrutiny. I found myself attending meetings with legitimate business leaders who either didn't know or didn't care about their partners' criminal connections as long as the profits continued to flow. Politicians, bank executives, and corporate CEOs would sit around conference tables discussing multi-million yen deals with men whose hands were stained with blood, treating them as respected business partners rather than dangerous criminals. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming by day. I would review quarterly reports for technology companies and real estate developments that employed thousands of honest workers. By night, I would structure payments for illegal gambling operations and protection rackets that terrorize small business owners. The money itself became an abstraction, numbers on computer screens that represented human suffering I preferred not to think about too deeply. I told myself that I was just managing financial instruments, that the actual crimes were committed by other people, that my technical expertise was morally neutral, regardless of how it was applied. But as the years passed and my responsibilities grew, it became increasingly difficult to maintain this psychological distance from the reality of what I was enabling. Every sophisticated financial structure I created made it easier for the organization to expand its criminal operations. Every successful money laundering scheme provided resources for violence and corruption. Every legitimate business I helped them acquire gave them more power to influence Japanese society in ways that served their interests rather than the public good. The turning point in my relationship with the organization came in 2015, when I was assigned to manage the financial aspects of what they called Project Rising Sun, a massive real estate development scheme that would have devastating consequences for thousands of ordinary Japanese families. The plan involved systematically acquiring properties in several Tokyo neighborhoods through a combination of legitimate purchases, fraudulent foreclosures, and intimidation tactics designed to force reluctant sellers to accept below-market prices. My job was to structure the financing in ways that would hide the organization's involvement while maximizing their profits from the eventual redevelopment of these areas into luxury commercial and residential complexes. On paper, the project looked like a brilliant example of urban renewal, transforming aging residential areas into modern developments that would boost property values and create jobs. In reality, it was a carefully orchestrated campaign of economic warfare against working-class communities that had existed for generations. I watched as elderly residents were pressured to sell family homes that had been passed down through multiple generations, as small business owners were driven into bankruptcy by sudden rent increases and mysterious regulatory problems, as entire neighborhoods were systematically dismantled to make way for developments that only the wealthy could afford. The financial mechanisms I designed made it all possible. Complex ownership structures that obscured the true buyers, predatory lending schemes that trapped property owners in impossible debt situations, and legal maneuvers that exploited loopholes in Japan's property laws to force sales that appeared voluntary but were actually coercive. For the first time since joining the organization, I was forced to confront the human cost of my expertise in a direct and undeniable way. These weren't abstract victims whose suffering I could ignore. They were real people whose faces I saw on the news, whose stories I read in newspapers, whose lives were being destroyed by financial instruments that bore my digital signature. The weight of this realization was crushing, but it also sparked something I hadn't felt in years, a desire to find a way out of the trap I had built around myself. The decision to begin secretly documenting the organization's financial operations was both the most dangerous and the most necessary choice I had ever made in my life. I knew that, if I was discovered, the consequences would be far worse than simple termination. The Yakuza had a long history of dealing permanently with traitors, and my knowledge of their financial secrets made me an existential threat to their entire operation. But I also knew that I couldn't continue to be complicit in the systematic destruction of innocent lives without at least attempting to create some mechanism for accountability and justice. I began by making copies of seemingly routine financial documents, using my legitimate access to the organization's computer systems to download transaction records, account statements, and correspondence that revealed the true scope of their criminal enterprises. The process required extreme caution and patience. I could only access small amounts of information at a time, had to vary my patterns to avoid detection by security software, and needed to find secure ways to store the evidence without leaving digital traces that could be discovered during routine system audits. Over the course of 2 years, I assembled a comprehensive archive that documented every aspect of the Sumiyoshi Kai's financial operations, detailed records of money laundering schemes, evidence of political corruption and bribery, documentation of market manipulation and fraud, and financial statements that revealed the true ownership structure of hundreds of legitimate businesses that served as fronts for criminal activities. The archive grew to include over 10,000 documents, spreadsheets, and digital files that painted a complete picture of how organized crime had infiltrated Japan's economy at every level. But collecting the evidence was only the first step. I also needed to find a way to use it effectively while protecting myself from retaliation. I couldn't simply turn it over to Japanese law enforcement, knowing that the organization had cultivated relationships with corrupt officials who might warn them about any investigation. Instead, I began reaching out to international authorities and investigative journalists who had the resources and independence necessary to act on the information I had gathered. Complexity of planning my escape from the Yakuza's financial empire required the same meticulous attention to detail that I had applied to their money laundering operations, but with the added challenge of operating under constant surveillance while maintaining the appearance of absolute loyalty. I knew that any sudden change in my behavior or routine would trigger suspicion, so I had to gradually implement my exit strategy over the course of several years while continuing to perform my duties with the same efficiency and dedication that had made me valuable to the organization. The first step was establishing secure communication channels with potential allies outside Japan who could help me when the time came to make my move. I made contact with financial crime investigators at the FBI, Interpol, and the European Union's Anti-Money Laundering Task Force, using encrypted messaging systems and anonymous email accounts to share samples of the evidence I had collected. These initial communications served multiple purposes. They verified the authenticity and value of my information, established my credibility as a potential cooperating witness, and began the process of negotiating the terms of my eventual defection. The international law enforcement community was extremely interested in what I had to offer. Sumiyoshi Kai's financial operations extended far beyond Japan's borders, involving banks and businesses in dozens of countries, and my documentation provided the missing pieces needed to understand how criminal proceeds were being laundered through the global financial system. But they also made it clear that protecting me would require careful coordination and timing, since the organization's reach extended into law enforcement agencies around the world. While these negotiations continued in secret, I also began the delicate process of extracting myself from the most sensitive aspects of my work without arousing suspicion. I gradually delegated responsibilities to subordinates, claiming that I wanted to focus on higher-level strategic planning rather than day-to-day operational details. I started taking more frequent business trips, ostensibly to manage the organization's international investments, but actually to meet with law enforcement contacts and establish safe houses in countries where I might need to seek refuge. The psychological toll of living a triple life, criminal financier, secret informant, and escape planner, was far more devastating than I had anticipated when I first began documenting the organization's activities. Every day brought new moral compromises as I continued to facilitate criminal operations while secretly working to expose them, knowing that each transaction I processed and each scheme I designed was causing real harm to innocent people, even as it brought me closer to my ultimate goal of bringing the entire network down. The stress manifested in physical symptoms that I struggled to hide from my colleagues: insomnia, anxiety attacks, and a constant state of hypervigilance that made normal social interactions increasingly difficult. I found myself unable to maintain personal relationships, knowing that anyone close to me could become a target if my true activities were discovered. The isolation was crushing, but it was also necessary. The fewer people who knew about my double life, the safer everyone would be when the inevitable confrontation finally came. My work performance actually improved during this period, as I channeled my nervous energy into creating even more sophisticated financial instruments and money laundering schemes, partly to maintain my cover, but also because I knew that the more evidence I could gather, the more devastating the eventual prosecution would be. I became obsessed with documenting every detail of the organization's operations, understanding that I might only get one chance to expose them, and that the evidence would need to be overwhelming and irrefutable to overcome their political connections and legal resources. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was becoming the best criminal financier in the organization's history, precisely because I was planning to destroy everything I had helped to build. My colleagues began to view me as indispensable, trusting me with increasingly sensitive information and giving me access to financial records that revealed connections to other criminal organizations throughout Asia. This access allowed me to expand my documentation beyond the Sumiashikai to include evidence of a vast international network of organized crime, groups that shared resources, laundered money through each other's systems, and coordinated their activities in ways that law enforcement had never fully understood. The final phase of my escape plan was triggered by an unexpected development that forced me to accelerate my timeline and take risks I had hoped to avoid. In early 2023, I learned that the organization was planning to promote me to a position that would have made it virtually impossible to maintain my secret activities. I was being considered for appointment as the chief financial officer of their entire operation, a role that would have required me to relocate to a secure compound where my movements would be constantly monitored and my access to outside communications severely restricted. The promotion was presented as the ultimate recognition of my value to the organization, but I understood that it was actually a gilded cage that would trap me permanently in their world. I had perhaps 6 months before the appointment would be finalized, which meant I needed to complete my evidence gathering, finalize my arrangements with international law enforcement, and execute my escape before I was moved to a position where defection would be impossible. The pressure was enormous, but it also provided the clarity and urgency I needed to overcome the psychological barriers that had been holding me back. I began making more aggressive moves to copy sensitive documents, taking calculated risks to access information that would normally be beyond my clearance level. I used my knowledge of the organization's security systems to cover my tracks, but I knew that each unauthorized access increased the chances of discovery. Meanwhile, my contacts in international law enforcement were finalizing the arrangements for my extraction and the coordinated raids that would follow my defection. The plan called for me to disappear during a routine business trip to Singapore, where I would be taken into protective custody by Interpol agents before being relocated to a secure facility in the United States, where I could provide detailed testimony about everything I had witnessed and documented. The timing had to be perfect. If I left too early, the organization might have time to destroy evidence and relocate their operations. If I waited too long, I might be discovered and eliminated before I could escape. As the date approached, I found myself in the surreal position of helping to plan the very operations that I would soon be exposing to authorities, knowing that my colleagues trusted me completely, even as I prepared to betray everything they had built together. The morning of my escape, March 15th, 2023, began like any other day in my 15-year career as a criminal financier, with routine meetings about currency exchanges and investment portfolios that masked the largest money laundering operation in Japanese history. I sat in the conference room of Pacific Prosperity Holdings, surrounded by colleagues who had become like family to me over the years, discussing quarterly projections and market opportunities, while knowing that this would be the last time I would ever see most of them. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These were people who had mentored me, trusted me with their secrets, and included me in their personal lives. But they were also criminals whose activities had caused immeasurable harm to innocent victims. As I participated in the meeting, reviewing financial reports and offering strategic recommendations, I was acutely aware that hidden in my briefcase were encrypted drives containing evidence that would destroy their lives and send many of them to prison for decades. The weight of this knowledge was crushing, but I forced myself to maintain the same professional demeanor that had served me well throughout my double life. After the meeting, I returned to my office to complete the final preparations for my departure, transferring the last batch of incriminating documents to secure servers and sending coded messages to my law enforcement contacts, confirming that the operation was proceeding as planned. My flight to Singapore was scheduled for 6 p.m., ostensibly for a routine meeting with potential investors, but actually the first step in my journey to freedom and a new identity in witness protection. As I packed my briefcase with the materials I would need for my testimony, I felt a mixture of relief and terror that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Relief that my years of living a lie were finally coming to an end, but terror at the unknown dangers that lay ahead, and the certainty that there would be no going back once I walked out of that office. The Sumiyoshi Kai would spare no expense in hunting me down, and I would spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, knowing that my betrayal had made me a target for one of the most ruthless criminal organizations in the world. The extraction itself went flawlessly, a testament to the months of careful planning and coordination between multiple international law enforcement agencies who understood the global significance of the evidence I was providing. I boarded my flight to Singapore without incident, maintaining the casual demeanor of a businessman traveling for routine meetings while internally counting down the minutes until I would be safely in protective custody. The 6-hour flight felt like an eternity, every moment bringing the possibility that my absence had been discovered and that agents of the organization might be waiting for me at Changi Airport. But when I landed and made my way through customs, the predetermined signal from my Interpol contactor, man reading a specific newspaper in the arrivals area, confirmed that everything was proceeding according to plan. Within minutes, I was whisked away to a secure facility where I began the process of formally defecting from the criminal organization that had defined my adult life. The debriefing sessions that followed were exhaustive and emotionally draining, as I spent weeks walking international investigators through every aspect of the financial empire I had helped to build and maintain. The scope of their interest went far beyond simple money laundering. My evidence revealed connections to terrorist financing, international arms trafficking, human smuggling operations, and political corruption networks that spanned multiple continents. The 10,000 documents I had collected over 2 years provided law enforcement with an unprecedented window into how modern organized crime operates in the digital age, showing how criminal proceeds flow through legitimate financial institutions and how corrupt networks exploit regulatory gaps between different countries. As I testified about transaction after transaction, scheme after scheme, I was forced to confront the full magnitude of what I had been part of for 15 years. The numbers were staggering: over 50 billion yen in criminal proceeds laundered annually, hundreds of legitimate businesses corrupted or controlled, thousands of victims whose lives had been destroyed by the organization's activities. My technical expertise had made all of it possible, and while I was now working to expose and dismantle the network, I couldn't escape the knowledge that I bore responsibility for much of the harm it had caused. The coordinated international raids that followed my defection were unprecedented in their scope and effectiveness, striking simultaneously at Yakuza financial operations in 12 countries and freezing assets worth over 100 billion yen in the largest organized crime takedown in modern history. I watched the news coverage from my secure location, seeing familiar faces being led away in handcuffs and recognizing business addresses where I had spent countless hours designing the very schemes that were now being exposed to the world. The raids were timed to prevent the organization from moving or destroying evidence, with law enforcement agencies in Japan, the United States, the United Kingdom, Singapore, and 8 other countries executing search warrants at exactly the same moment to maximize the element of surprise. The evidence I had provided proved to be even more valuable than investigators had hoped. My detailed documentation of financial flows and ownership structures allowed them to trace criminal proceeds through multiple layers of shell companies and legitimate businesses, revealing the true extent of the Yakuza's infiltration into the global economy. Within 48 hours, over 200 arrests had been made, including several high-ranking members of the Sumiyoshi-kai leadership and dozens of corrupt officials in banks, regulatory agencies, and government officers who had facilitated their operations. The financial impact was devastating for the organization. Not only were their liquid assets frozen, but their ability to conduct future operations was severely compromised by the exposure of their methods and the arrest of key personnel who possessed critical knowledge about their systems. But I also knew that the organization's response would be swift and merciless, and that my betrayal had made me the primary target of their revenge. Intelligence reports confirmed that they had placed a substantial bounty on my head and were using their remaining resources to locate me. Despite the extensive security measures that had been put in place to protect my identity and location, the psychological pressure of living under constant threat was immense, but it was offset by the satisfaction of knowing that my decision to come forward had struck a devastating blow against one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations and would prevent countless future victims from suffering at their hands. The legal proceedings that followed the raids that stretched over 3 years, during which I served as the prosecution's star witness in multiple jurisdictions, testifying in courtrooms from Tokyo to New York about the intricate financial mechanisms that had allowed the Sumiyoshi-kai to operate with impunity for decades. Each trial was a grueling experience that required me to relive my years as a criminal financier while facing cross-examination from defense attorneys who were determined to discredit my testimony and portray me as an unreliable witness seeking to save himself by fabricating evidence against former colleagues. The psychological toll was enormous. I was forced to confront my own culpability in the organization's crimes while simultaneously serving as the instrument of justice that would bring them to account for their actions. The defense teams employed every possible strategy to undermine my credibility, arguing that I was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, a pathological liar who had fabricated evidence for personal gain, or a master manipulator who had orchestrated the entire criminal enterprise and was now attempting to shift blame to innocent victims. But the documentary evidence I had collected was overwhelming and irrefutable: thousands of financial records, email communications, and transaction logs that painted a complete picture of how the organization operated and left no room for doubt about the guilt of the defendants. One by one, the trials resulted in convictions that would effectively dismantle the Sumiya Shikai's financial empire and send its leadership to prison for decades. The sentences were severe life imprisonment for the top bosses, 20 to 30-year terms for mid-level managers, and substantial prison time even for lower-level operatives who had played supporting roles in the organization's activities. The financial penalties were equally devastating, with courts ordering the forfeiture of billions of yen in assets and imposing fines that would prevent the organization from rebuilding its operations, even if its members were eventually released from prison. But perhaps the most significant impact was the precedent these cases established for international cooperation in combating organized crime, demonstrating that criminal networks could no longer hide behind national borders or exploit jurisdictional gaps to avoid prosecution. The personal cost of my decision to expose the Yakuza's financial empire has been enormous and ongoing, requiring me to live under an assumed identity in a foreign country where I have no family, no friends from my previous life, and no connection to the culture and society that shaped my first 35 years. The witness protection program provided me with excellent security and a comfortable standard of living, but it couldn't replace the human connections and sense of belonging that I had sacrificed in exchange for justice and redemption. I was given a new name, a fabricated personal history, and extensive training in how to maintain my cover identity. But I could never escape the knowledge that my real life had ended the moment I walked out of that Tokyo office building and boarded the flight to Singapore. The psychological adjustment was far more difficult than I had anticipated. I found myself grieving not just for the life I had lost, but for the person I had been before I became entangled in the criminal world. The young accountant who had graduated from Yakuza University with dreams of building an honest career seems like a stranger to me now, someone whose innocence and optimism had been systematically destroyed by 15 years of moral compromise and criminal activity. I struggled with depression, anxiety, and a profound sense of guilt that no amount of good deeds could fully alleviate. Yes, I had helped to bring down one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations, but I had also been complicit in their crimes for over a decade, and the harm they had caused during that time was irreversible. The families who had lost their homes in the real estate schemes I had designed, the small business owners who had been driven into bankruptcy by the financial instruments I had created, the countless victims of crimes that had been funded by money I had helped to launder, their suffering was real and permanent, and my eventual cooperation with law enforcement couldn't undo the damage I had helped to cause. I began working with therapists who specialized in helping former criminals adjust a legitimate life, but the process of rebuilding my moral foundation and learning to live with my past was slow and painful. 5 years after my escape from the Yakuza's financial empire, I have built a new life that focuses on using my expertise to combat the very crimes I once facilitated. Working as a consultant for international law enforcement agencies and financial institutions that are struggling to identify and prevent sophisticated money laundering operations. The irony is not lost on me. I am now paid to design systems that would have detected and prevented the schemes I once created, using my intimate knowledge of criminal financial methods to help legitimate organizations protect themselves from the kind of infiltration I once specialized in. My work involves training bank compliance officers to recognize suspicious transaction patterns, helping regulatory agencies understand how criminals exploit loopholes in international banking laws, and assisting prosecutors in complex financial crime cases where my experience provides crucial insights into criminal methodologies. The transition from criminal to crime fighter has been professionally rewarding but emotionally complex, as I am constantly reminded of my past while working to prevent others from following the same destructive path. I have become something of an expert on the psychology of financial crime, understanding from personal experience how intelligent, educated people can gradually become complicit in criminal activities through a series of small compromises that seem individually justifiable but collectively lead to moral catastrophe. This insight has proven valuable in developing prevention programs that target the recruitment methods used by criminal organizations to corrupt legitimate professionals. I work with universities to educate business students about the warning signs of criminal infiltration, help professional associations develop ethical guidelines that make it harder for criminals to exploit their members, and assist law enforcement agencies in understanding how to approach potential cooperating witnesses who may be trapped in criminal organizations against their better judgment. The work is meaningful and important, but it also serves as a constant reminder of the choices I made and the harm I caused during my years as a criminal financier. Every case I work on, every scheme I help to uncover, every criminal I help to prosecute brings back memories of my own complicity in similar activities. The most challenging aspect of my new life has been learning to form genuine relationships with people who know nothing about my criminal past, while constantly managing the fear that my true identity might be discovered and put both myself and anyone close to me in danger. The Sumiyoshi Kai may have been severely damaged by the prosecutions that followed my defection, but organized crime networks have long memories and substantial resources for revenge, and I know that there are still people searching for me who would not hesitate to kill me if they discovered my location. This knowledge affects every aspect of my daily life. I avoid social media, change my routines regularly, and maintain a level of vigilance that makes spontaneous friendships and romantic relationships extremely difficult. I have learned to live with loneliness as a necessary price for safety, but the isolation is sometimes overwhelming, especially during holidays and special occasions when I am reminded of the family and cultural connections I can never reclaim. The Witness Protection Program provides excellent security, but it cannot provide the human warmth and belonging that are essential for psychological well-being. I have attempted to build new relationships based on my assumed identity, but the constant need to maintain my cover story creates a barrier to genuine intimacy that is difficult to overcome. How do you explain to someone you care about where you have no photographs from your childhood, no college friends to reminisce with, no family members to visit during holidays? The lies necessary to maintain my cover become increasingly complex and emotionally exhausting, and I sometimes wonder if the isolation is worse than the physical danger I escaped. But then I remember the victims of the crimes I helped to facilitate, and I remind myself that my discomfort is a small price to pay for the justice that was finally served and the future crimes that were prevented by my cooperation. I have found some solace in volunteer work with organizations that help victims of financial crimes, though I can never reveal the personal experience that drives my commitment to their cause. Working with people who have lost their life savings to sophisticated fraud schemes or had their businesses destroyed by criminal infiltration gives me a sense of purpose and connection that helps to offset the loneliness of my isolated existence. The global impact of the evidence I provided has extended far beyond the prosecution of the Sumiyoshi-kai, leading to fundamental changes in how international law enforcement agencies approach organized crime and how financial institutions implement anti-money laundering measures. The detailed documentation I collected revealed patterns and methodologies that were previously unknown to investigators, showing how criminal organizations exploit specific vulnerabilities in the global financial system and how they adapt their operations to evade detection by traditional law enforcement methods. This intelligence has been used to develop new investigative techniques, improve international cooperation protocols, and create more effective regulatory frameworks that make it harder for criminals to launder money through legitimate financial institutions. Central banks and regulatory agencies around the world have implemented new reporting requirements and monitoring systems based on the insights gained from my case. And several countries have strengthened their laws governing shell companies and offshore banking to close the loopholes that criminal organizations had been exploiting for decades. The ripple effects continue to be felt throughout the criminal underworld, as other organizations have been forced to modify their operations in response to the new security measures and investigative capabilities that emerged from the Sumiyoshi-kai prosecutions. Intelligence reports suggest that my defection has made criminal organizations more paranoid about insider threats, leading them to implement more stringent security measures that actually make their operations less efficient and more vulnerable to detection. The psychological impact on criminal leadership has been significant. Someone as trusted and valuable as I was could turn against the organization. Then no one could be considered completely reliable, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that undermines the loyalty and cooperation that these groups depend on for their survival. This paranoia has led to internal conflicts and power struggles within several major criminal organizations, as leaders become increasingly suspicious of their subordinates and begin eliminating potential threats in ways that often damage their own operational capabilities. The long-term effect has been to make organized crime less organized and more vulnerable to law enforcement, infiltration, and disruption. Perhaps the most unexpected consequence of my decision to expose the Yakuza's financial empire has been the opportunity to help other individuals who find themselves trapped in criminal organizations and are looking for a way out. Through my work with law enforcement agencies, I have been contacted by dozens of people in situations similar to my own, professionals who were recruited by criminal organizations for their legitimate skills but gradually became complicit in illegal activities and now want to escape without destroying their lives or endangering their families. These individuals come from all walks of life: lawyers who discovered that their clients were money laundering operations, accountants who realized that their firms were being used to hide criminal proceeds, technology experts who found themselves developing systems for illegal gambling or cryptocurrency fraud, and business executives who learned that their companies were fronts for organized crime. Each case is unique, but they all share common elements: intelligent people who made compromises they thought they could control, who gradually became more deeply involved in criminal activities than they ever intended, and who now face the terrifying choice between continued complicity and the enormous risks associated with cooperation with law enforcement. I have become an informal counselor, an advisor for these potential defectors, helping them understand their options, evaluate the risks and benefits of cooperation, and develop strategies for safely extracting themselves from criminal organizations while providing valuable intelligence to authorities. The work is deeply personal for me, as I see reflections of my own journey in their stories and understand the psychological and practical challenges they face in ways that traditional law enforcement officers cannot. I help them navigate the complex process of becoming cooperating witnesses, prepare for the emotional trauma of betraying former colleagues, and adjust to the reality of life in witness protection or under assumed identities. Many of these individuals have provided crucial intelligence that has led to additional prosecutions and the disruption of criminal networks around the world, creating a cascading effect where each successful defection makes it easier for others to come forward and contributes to the gradual erosion of organized crimes, power, and influence. The financial crime landscape has evolved significantly since my defection, with criminal organizations adapting their methods to address the vulnerabilities that my case exposed, while law enforcement agencies have developed new capabilities to detect and prevent sophisticated money laundering operations. The cat-and-mouse game between criminals and authorities has intensified, with both sides employing increasingly sophisticated technologies and methodologies in their ongoing battle for advantage. Cryptocurrency has emerged as a major new frontier in this conflict, with criminal organizations embracing digital currencies as a way to move money across borders without the traditional banking oversight that my evidence helped to strengthen. However, law enforcement agencies have also developed new capabilities for tracking cryptocurrency transactions, and the blockchain technology that criminals thought would provide anonymity has actually created permanent records that can be analyzed using advanced data analytics and artificial intelligence. The result has been a series of major cryptocurrency-related prosecutions that have demonstrated that digital currencies are not the safe haven for criminal proceeds that many organizations had hoped they would be. Meanwhile, traditional money laundering methods have become more sophisticated and compartmentalized, with criminal organizations implementing cellular structures that limit the amount of information any single individual can access, a direct response to the comprehensive intelligence that my defection provided to authorities. These new security measures make criminal organizations more resilient to individual defections, but they also make their operations less efficient and more vulnerable to systematic law enforcement infiltration. The overall trend has been towards smaller, more specialized criminal networks that focus on specific types of crimes rather than the large, diversified organizations like the Sumir Shikai that dominated the landscape when I was active. This fragmentation has made it more difficult for any single criminal group to achieve the kind of systemic influence that the Yakuza once wielded over Japan's economy. But it has also created new challenges for law enforcement agencies that must now track and investigate dozens of smaller networks, rather than focusing on a few major organizations. The psychological journey of rebuilding my identity and moral foundation after 15 years as a criminal financier has been far more complex and ongoing than I anticipated when I first decided to cooperate with law enforcement. The process of confronting my own complicity in criminal activities, while simultaneously working to combat similar crimes, has required me to develop a nuanced understanding of guilt, responsibility, and redemption that goes far beyond simple legal concepts of right and wrong. I have had to learn to live with the knowledge that I cannot undo the harm I help to cause, while finding ways to channel my expertise and experience into activities that serve the greater good and help prevent future victims from suffering similar harm. This psychological balancing act is exhausting and sometimes overwhelming, but it has also led to insights about human nature and moral decision-making that have proven valuable in my work with other potential defectors and in my contributions to law enforcement training programs. I have come to understand that most people who become involved in criminal activities are not inherently evil, but rather individuals who make a series of small compromises that gradually erode their moral boundaries until they find themselves complicit in activities they would have found abhorrent in their earlier lives. This understanding has made me more effective at identifying potential cooperating witnesses and helping them navigate the complex process of extracting themselves from criminal organizations. It has also informed my work on prevention programs that target the recruitment methods used by criminal organizations to corrupt legitimate professionals. The key insight is that criminal recruitment is often a gradual process that exploits normal human desires for success, belonging, and financial security, rather than a dramatic moment of moral choice between good and evil. By understanding these psychological mechanisms, we can develop more effective strategies for identifying and interrupting the recruitment process before individuals become so deeply involved that cooperation with law enforcement becomes their only viable option for escape. This work has given my life a sense of purpose and meaning that helps to offset the loneliness and isolation of my protected existence. The technological revolution in financial services has created both new opportunities and new challenges for combating money laundering and other financial crimes, requiring constant adaptation of the methods and systems that I help to develop. Based on my experience with traditional criminal financial operations, artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms have dramatically improved the ability of financial institutions to detect suspicious transaction patterns. But criminal organizations have also begun using similar technologies to optimize their money laundering operations and evade detection. The result is an escalating technological arms race, where both sides are constantly developing new capabilities and countermeasures in response to their opponents' innovations. Blockchain technology and cryptocurrency have fundamentally altered the landscape of international money transfers, creating new possibilities for both criminal exploitation and law enforcement investigation. While criminals initially embraced cryptocurrency as a way to move money anonymously across borders, the permanent and transparent nature of blockchain records has actually made it easier for investigators to trace criminal proceeds once they understand how to analyze these new types of financial data. My work now involves helping law enforcement agencies develop the technical capabilities and analytical frameworks needed to investigate cryptocurrency-related crimes, while also assisting financial institutions in implementing compliance systems that can detect suspicious cryptocurrency transactions. The challenge is that these new technologies evolve so rapidly that training and regulatory frameworks struggle to keep pace, creating temporary windows of vulnerability that criminal organizations are quick to exploit. This dynamic environment requires constant learning and adaptation, both for the criminals trying to stay ahead of law enforcement and for the investigators working to detect and prevent their activities. The most successful approaches combine traditional investigative methods with cutting-edge technology, using human intelligence and relationship analysis to understand criminal networks while employing advanced data analytics to track their financial activities across multiple platforms and jurisdictions. 10 years after my escape from the Yakuza's financial empire, I can see the long-term impact of my decision to cooperate with law enforcement, not just in terms of the specific prosecutions and asset forfeitures that resulted from my testimony, but in the broader changes to how organized crime operates and how society responds to these threats. The comprehensive intelligence I provided has been used to develop new theoretical frameworks for understanding organized crime as a form of alternative governance that competes with legitimate state institutions for control over economic and social activities. This academic research has informed policy discussions about how to strengthen legitimate institutions and reduce the social conditions that make criminal organizations attractive to potential recruits and collaborators. The evidence I collected has also been used in international forums to advocate for stronger cooperation between law enforcement agencies and more consistent regulatory frameworks that make it harder for criminal organizations to exploit jurisdictional differences and regulatory gaps. Several international treaties and agreements have been strengthened or created based on lessons learned from the Sumiyoshi Kai case, improving the global community's ability to combat transnational organized crime. But perhaps the most important long-term impact has been the demonstration that even the most sophisticated and well-protected criminal organizations are vulnerable to exposure and prosecution when insiders are willing to come forward with evidence of their activities. This precedent has encouraged other potential whistleblowers to contact law enforcement agencies, leading to a cascade of additional cases that have significantly weakened organized crime's influence over legitimate economic and political institutions. The psychological impact on criminal leadership has been profound. The knowledge that trusted insiders might be documenting their activities and planning to defect has made criminal organizations more paranoid and less efficient. While the success of witness protection programs has reduced the deterrent effect of threats and intimidation, the overall result has been a measurable decline in the power and influence of traditional organized crime groups, though this has sometimes been offset by the emergence of new types of criminal networks that are more decentralized and harder to infiltrate. The personal cost of my transformation from criminal financier to law enforcement asset has been enormous, but it has also provided me with a unique perspective on the nature of justice, redemption, and the possibility of positive change, even in the darkest circumstances. I have learned that true accountability requires not just punishment for past crimes, but active efforts to prevent future harm and to help repair the damage that criminal activities have caused to individuals and communities. This understanding has shaped my approach to the work I do now, focusing not just on helping to prosecute criminals, but on developing systems and programs that address the root causes of criminal recruitment and provide alternatives for people who might otherwise be drawn into illegal activities. I work with educational institutions to develop curricula that help business and finance students understand the ethical dimensions of their future careers and recognize the warning signs of criminal infiltration. I assist community organizations in creating support networks for individuals who are trying to escape from criminal organizations or rebuild their lives after serving prison sentences for financial crimes. Most importantly, I try to use my story as an example of how people can change direction even after making terrible choices, demonstrating that redemption is possible for those who are willing to accept responsibility for their actions and work to make amends for the harm they have caused. This message is particularly important for young people who may be facing the same kinds of choices I confronted as a recent university graduate: the choice between easy money and moral integrity, between belonging to a powerful organization and maintaining personal autonomy, between short-term success and long-term consequences. My experience shows that the apparent benefits of criminal involvement are ultimately illusory, while the costs, both personal and social, real and lasting. But it also shows that it is never too late to choose a different path, even for someone who has been deeply involved in criminal activities for many years. The key is having the courage to acknowledge past mistakes, accept the risks associated with change, and commit to using whatever skills and knowledge you have acquired in service of legitimate goals rather than criminal enterprises. The evolution of my relationship with my own past has been one of the most challenging aspects of building a new life after escaping from the Yakuza's financial empire. For many years, I struggled with shame and self-hatred over my role in facilitating criminal activities, unable to reconcile the person I had become with the values I thought I held and the life I had originally planned to live. The weight of knowing that my expertise had enabled crimes that caused real harm to innocent people was crushing, and I often wondered whether my eventual cooperation with law enforcement was motivated by genuine remorse or simply by self-preservation and a desire to escape the consequences of my choices. Working with therapists who specialized in helping former criminals adjust to legitimate life, I gradually learned to develop a more nuanced understanding of guilt and responsibility that allowed me to acknowledge my complicity in harmful activities while also recognizing my capacity for positive change. This process required me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own character and motivations, including the recognition that my initial involvement with the criminal organization had been driven not just by economic necessity, but also by ambition, excitement, and a desire to be part of something powerful and exclusive. Understanding these psychological factors was essential for preventing myself from making similar choices in the future, and for helping other potential defectors recognize and address their own motivations for criminal involvement. I learned that true redemption requires not just changing your behavior, but understanding why you made harmful choices in the first place, and developing the self-awareness and emotional skills necessary to make better decisions going forward. This internal work has been just as important as my external efforts to combat financial crime. because it has given me the psychological foundation necessary to maintain my commitment to legitimate activities, even when faced with temptations or pressures that might otherwise lead me back toward criminal involvement. The process is ongoing. I continue to work with mental health professionals and participate in support groups for former criminals, because I understand that the risk of relapse is always present, and that maintaining my moral compass requires constant vigilance and self-reflection. The broader implications of my case extend beyond organized crime and financial regulation into fundamental questions about corporate responsibility, professional ethics, and the role of individual conscience in complex institutional settings. The ease with which I was able to infiltrate legitimate financial institutions and use their systems for money laundering purposes reveals serious weaknesses in the ethical frameworks and oversight mechanisms that are supposed to prevent such exploitation. Many of the banks, investment firms, and regulatory agencies that unknowingly facilitated the Sumiyoshi Kai's operations had compliance programs and ethical guidelines that looked impressive on paper but failed to detect or prevent sophisticated criminal infiltration in practice. This disconnect between formal policies and actual effectiveness has become a major focus of my current work, as I help organizations develop more robust systems for identifying and addressing ethical risks before they become criminal liabilities. The key insight from my experience is that criminal organizations succeed not by overwhelming legitimate institutions with force, but by exploiting their weaknesses and blind spots, their gaps between departments that don't communicate effectively, the performance incentives that reward results without asking too many questions about methods, the cultural norms that discourage whistleblowing or challenge to authority. Addressing these vulnerabilities requires more than just better policies and procedures. It requires fundamental changes in organizational culture that prioritize ethical behavior over short-term profits and create safe channels for employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. I work with companies to develop training programs that help employees recognize the warning signs of criminal infiltration and understand their ethical obligations when faced with suspicious activities. I also assist in creating whistleblower protection programs that provide real security for individuals who come forward with evidence of wrongdoing, because my experience has shown that insider cooperation is often the only way to detect and prevent sophisticated criminal schemes. These efforts are part of a broader movement toward greater corporate accountability and transparency that has gained momentum in response to high-profile cases of financial crime and corruption around the world. The international dimension of modern financial crime has made my experience increasingly relevant to law enforcement agencies and policymakers around the world who are struggling to combat criminal organizations that operate across multiple jurisdictions and exploit differences in national laws and regulatory frameworks. The Sumiyoshi Kai case demonstrated how criminal organizations use legitimate businesses and financial institutions in dozens of countries to launder money and hide their activities, creating a complex web of transactions that can only be unraveled through unprecedented levels of international cooperation and information sharing. My testimony in courts around the world has helped to establish legal precedents for prosecuting transnational financial crimes and has provided practical insights into how criminal organizations adapt their methods to exploit specific vulnerabilities in different national systems. This intelligence has been used to develop new international protocols for sharing financial intelligence, coordinating investigations across borders, and ensuring that criminals cannot escape prosecution simply by moving their operations from one country to another. The work involves not just law enforcement agencies but also central banks, regulatory authorities, and international organizations that are working to create more consistent and effective frameworks for combating money laundering and terrorist financing. One of the most important lessons from my case is that effective action against transnational organized crime requires not just better laws and enforcement mechanisms, but also changes in the culture and practices of legitimate financial institutions that make them less vulnerable to criminal exploitation. This means implementing more rigorous due diligence procedures, developing better systems for detecting suspicious transactions, and creating stronger incentives for compliance with anti-money laundering regulations. It also means addressing the competitive pressures and profit motives that sometimes lead legitimate businesses to ask fewer questions than they should about the sources of large deposits or the purposes of complex transactions. The goal is to create a global financial system that is more transparent, more accountable, and more resistant to criminal infiltration, while still maintaining the efficiency and innovation that are essential for legitimate economic activity. The personal relationships I have been able to build in my new life have been shaped by the constant tension between my desire for genuine human connection and the security requirements that prevent me from revealing my true identity and past experiences. Learning to form meaningful friendships and romantic relationships while maintaining an elaborate cover story has required me to develop new skills in emotional compartmentalization and selective honesty that I never needed during my previous life. I have had to learn to be authentic about my current thoughts, feelings, and values, while being completely deceptive about my personal history and the experiences that shaped those values. This psychological balancing act is exhausting and sometimes leads to feelings of isolation, even when I'm surrounded by people who care about me. The relationships I have formed are real and meaningful, but they are also built on a foundation of necessary deception that creates barriers to the kind of deep intimacy that comes from sharing your complete self with another person. I have found ways to work around these limitations by focusing on present moment connections and shared activities, rather than dwelling on past experiences, and by being as honest as possible about my current beliefs and aspirations, even when I cannot explain how I developed them. Some of my closest relationships are with other individuals in witness protection or similar situations. People who understand the challenges of building a new identity while carrying the weight of a hidden past. These connections have been invaluable for my psychological well-being, providing a sense of community and understanding that would be impossible to find among people who have never faced similar challenges. I have also found meaning in mentoring young professionals who are just beginning their careers in finance and business, helping them understand the ethical dimensions of their work and the importance of maintaining their integrity even when faced with pressures or temptations that might lead them toward questionable activities. While I cannot share the specific details of my own experience, I can use the wisdom I have gained to help others avoid the mistakes I made and build careers that serve legitimate purposes, rather than criminal enterprises. The technological and methodological innovations that have emerged from the intelligence I provided continue to evolve and improve, creating new capabilities for detecting and preventing financial crimes, while also spurring criminal organizations to develop new methods for evading detection. The constant adaptation on both sides has created a dynamic environment where success requires continuous learning, innovation, and collaboration between different types of experts and institutions. My current work involves helping to bridge the gap between technical specialists who understand the mechanics of financial systems and investigators who understand criminal behavior, translating between these different domains of expertise to create more effective approaches to combating sophisticated financial crimes. This interdisciplinary collaboration has led to breakthrough insights about how criminal organizations exploit specific technical vulnerabilities and how legitimate institutions can modify their systems and procedures to close these security gaps. The most promising developments involve the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to analyze vast amounts of financial data and identify patterns that would be impossible for human analysts to detect manually. These systems can process millions of transactions in real time, flagging suspicious activities and relationships that might indicate money laundering or other criminal financial activities. However, the effectiveness of these technological solutions depends on having high-quality training data and sophisticated algorithms that can distinguish between legitimate business activities and criminal schemes, areas where my experience with both sides of the equation has proven invaluable. I work with technology companies and financial institutions to develop and refine these systems, using my knowledge of criminal methodologies to help create detection algorithms that are more accurate and less prone to false positives. The goal is to create automated systems that can identify potential criminal activities quickly and accurately, while still allowing legitimate businesses to operate efficiently without unnecessary regulatory burdens or compliance costs. 15 years after my escape from the Yakuza's financial empire, I can reflect on the journey with a perspective that encompasses both the enormous personal costs and the significant positive impact that my decision to cooperate with law enforcement has had on the global fight against organized crime. The life I have built in witness protection is comfortable and meaningful, but it will never fully compensate for the relationships, cultural connections, and sense of belonging that I sacrificed when I chose to expose the criminal organization that had defined my adult life. The loneliness and isolation are permanent features of my existence, prices I will continue to pay for the rest of my life, in exchange for the knowledge that I helped to prevent countless future victims from suffering at the hands of sophisticated criminal networks. But I have also found unexpected sources of satisfaction and purpose in my work as a consultant and educator, using my unique expertise to help others understand and combat the financial crimes that continue to plague societies around the world. The young professionals I mentor, the law enforcement officers I train, and the potential defectors I counsel all represent opportunities to multiply the positive impact of my decision to come forward, creating ripple effects that extend far beyond the specific prosecutions that resulted from my testimony. Perhaps most importantly, I've learned that redemption is not a destination, but a continuous process of choosing to use whatever knowledge and capabilities you possess in service of legitimate goals rather than criminal enterprises. This understanding has given me a framework for living with my past while working toward a future that serves the greater good, even when that work must be conducted under an assumed identity in a foreign country, far from everything I once called home. The story I have shared with you today is not just about organized crime or financial regulation, but about the fundamental human capacity for change and the possibility of finding meaning and purpose, even in the most difficult circumstances. If my experience can help even one person recognize the warning signs of criminal recruitment, resist the temptations of easy money, or find the courage to come forward with evidence of wrongdoing, then the sacrifices I have made will have been worthwhile. If this story has resonated with you, if it has made you think about the choices we all face between short-term gain and long-term integrity, between belonging to powerful organizations and maintaining personal autonomy, then I ask you to take action that could help prevent others from making the same mistakes I made. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this need to reach young professionals who are just starting their careers and may be vulnerable to recruitment by criminal organizations that disguise themselves as legitimate business opportunities. Give this video a like if you believe that people can change, that redemption is possible even for those who have been complicit in serious crimes, and that sharing difficult truths can serve a greater purpose than protecting comfortable illusions. But most importantly, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts about the ethical challenges that professionals face in today's complex global economy, the warning signs that might indicate criminal infiltration of legitimate businesses, and the support systems that could help people resist or escape from criminal organizations. Your voice matters in this conversation, because the fight against organized crime requires not just law enforcement action, but also social awareness and individual courage to recognize and report suspicious activities. Share this story with others who work in finance, business, or any field where they might encounter opportunities that seem too good to be true, or organizations that operate with unusual secrecy or ethical flexibility. Help create a culture where asking questions about the sources of money and the purposes of transactions is seen as professional responsibility rather than unwelcomed skepticism. Together, we can build a more transparent and accountable economic system that serves legitimate purposes rather than criminal enterprises, where young professionals understand both the temptations they may face and resources available to help them make ethical choices even under pressure. The financial empire I helped to build and ultimately destroy was sustained by the silence and complicities of countless individuals who chose not to ask difficult questions or challenge suspicious activities. By sharing this story and encouraging others to speak up when they encounter potential wrongdoing, we can ensure that future criminal organizations will find it much harder to exploit legitimate institutions and corrupt honest professionals. Make your voice part of the solution.